Hi folks, Ryan Honeyman here from Lift Economy. Many folks have come to us over the last 10 years and asked, how do I get more involved in creating an economy that works for the benefit of all life? They also ask, what skills and experiences do I need to help make this transition? So 3 years ago, we created something called the Next Economy MBA to help address this and similar questions. Lift Economy's Next Economy MBA is an online course that's designed for entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, students, recent graduates, employees, and folks who want to learn more about transformational Next Economy strategies and businesses. Join the growing alumni network of nearly 250 alumni who've gone through this program and learned essential skills and hopefully built lifelong relationships for catalyzing businesses in the emergent and regenerative economy. So we encourage you to check out our course. You can go to lifteconomy.com/MBA. The next course, Cohort 7, starts on September 21st, 2021. So once again, go to www.lifteconomy.com/MBA. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. The goal of this podcast series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, equitable, democratic, racially just, and whole systems approach to creating the new economy.
Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ryan. Pleasure to be here.
Dan, let's start with a little bit about your personal background. Where do you consider home and why?
Oh, that's an interesting question. My wife and I have just moved from Western Massachusetts to just about 30 minutes north of Manhattan. And we thought we'd be back and forth, but actually we kind of like it here. We're in the New York metro area, and my wife's from Manhattan. And we moved our horses. We have an Icelandic and a Mini. We moved them here. That pretty much makes here home.
Wow, that's great. One of my business partners is in Marlborough in the Hudson Valley.
I'm looking at the Hudson right now as we speak. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Very close, yeah.
Well, I know you're steeped in the mindfulness meditation tradition, and I'm curious, from early on, was there a particular event or experience or teacher that first got you interested in meditation or mindfulness?
The book I just finished, After Force for Good, is about meditation. It was co-authored with a neuroscientist, Richard Davidson, who's been my best buddy since graduate school. And that book looks at all the best research on meditation. My own personal interest started in college because I found meditation helped me be less anxious, and that was great. It also helped me take a nap, which I needed. I was chronically sleep deprived. Then I got to India. I was a graduate student in psychology at Harvard, and my fellowship included a year of travel and study abroad. I had just met Ram Dass, who had just returned from India, and, tales of yogis and so on, and I was very enchanted. I ended up in Bodh Gaya, India, studying with a man named Manindraji, who was the main teacher of Joseph Goldstein, who founded the Insight Meditation Society and has trained a lot of the current generation of Insight meditation teachers. And then S.N. Goenka, who we call Goenkaji, who was just starting to teach Westerners. I did a series of courses with him. They were very, very powerful. And I more or less continued that practice of insight meditation for many years. At the same time, I wanted to figure out, well, what are all these other things people are doing and how are they different or the same? So my first book was actually called The Meditative Mind. It was a typology and a kind of comparison of all the different meditation practices. So when I did the Goenka courses, Sharon Salzberg was a fellow student, Joseph Goldstein. When I got back to Cambridge, I became friends with John Kabat-Zinn. And the three of them, along with Jack Kornfield, who I met there, have probably done more to spread mindfulness in this culture than any other group of people. So I've been in on mindfulness from the start. And when I say I did a insight meditation practice, mindfulness is the core of that practice. So I've been intrigued and actually very pleased to see mindfulness spreading. And I think in terms of the business world, where it's been spreading pretty well, it's important as a foundation for a different kind of leadership, a leadership which is more present, both to yourself as a leader and to other people. And I think that that's all to the good, because if you're going to innovate, if you're going to lead a business that has a positive impact, I think the kind of person you are as you lead actually matters. And so I'd say mindfulness plus emotional intelligence, which was the topic of my first book, first well-known book, is a winning combination for that kind of leadership.
Yeah, maybe for folks who don't know, what you define as emotional intelligence?
Sure. So emotional intelligence is talking about a different way of being smart. It's not how well you did in school or, can you do this programming language? It's what kind of person are you? How do you manage yourself? How do you handle your relationships? Are you toxic or are you nourishing, essentially? And I've broken down the skill set of emotional intelligence into 4 parts: self-awareness, and of course, mindfulness training in self-awareness, self-management, how you handle your emotions, do you stay motivated, and so on. Are you adaptable? And then empathy, are you able to tune into the other person's emotions? And then relationship skills, which put together all of those. I've actually broken them down into 12 specific competencies that outstanding leaders tend to display. Things like being self-aware, being empathic, being adaptable, being good at inspiring people and sharing a larger purpose to what we're doing. And I'm writing about them in a set of primers that are available from More Than Sound. That's one word, morethansound.net. But each of them explores a capacity of leadership within the emotional intelligence domain that we find in the people that are high performing, that are outstanding.
We had a guest on our podcast. She's working with, I think, the CEO of Shell Oil to be about mindfulness and leadership. I'm curious, to what extent can individual mindfulness or emotional intelligence, how effective is it if the sort of business, the business itself is maybe destructive or, is publicly traded? It makes it even harder. I'm kind of curious on your balance of sort of the individual and the sort of business context, how those two, maybe there's a tension there.
Sure. The research that I got into on this is actually done by companies themselves. It's what's called competence modeling. When I was at Harvard, my main mentor there was a professor named David McClelland, who back then proposed that instead of looking at people's GPA or personality profiles, you look at the competencies that make people outstanding in your own organization. You hire people that have those abilities, or you train people to develop them, and you promote people who have them. That's pretty standard operating procedure in major companies of all kinds, the best companies and maybe some of the not so good companies, but companies that are trying to remain competitive, because those abilities, the competencies, identify people who are high performing, however you define that in your particular business. So I was interested in leadership and what makes someone an outstanding leader. That's where my colleague Richard Boyatzis, who's another McClellan student now at Case Western School of Management, he and I and a consultancy called the Hay Group, now Korn Ferry Hay Group, developed this map of 12, which are pretty generic. They come up over and over. And what's interesting is that companies themselves identify these abilities. And I think these abilities are, in a sense, value neutral in terms of the dimension that matters so much to impact and, making the world a better place and force for good. They can be used just to make people high performing no matter what the goal is. I think, however, what matters today more than ever is that people feel good inside about what they're doing, that the mission is actually making the world a better place. I think that alone is distinguishing leaders going into the future, perhaps from leaders in multinationals, in for-profits, and companies that are owned by shareholders and trying to help shareholders only. I think that might be an older model, and that going into the future, particularly with the environmental crisis looming, and also the more and more obvious needs for social and economic justice, that high-performing people will also gravitate toward businesses, toward positions that allow them to bring that kind of work into what they're doing, along with whatever else the role demands. So I think that the winning combination going in the future will be mindfulness, which gives you that base of presence and empathy, emotional intelligence, which adds the specific abilities that can make you an outstanding performer as a leader, and then values, having a mission that really inspires you and the people around you. I think that's the formula for the future.
You mentioned the force for good. I'm really glad that that's the title of your most recent book. I guess your future upcoming book is around meditation, mindfulness. I'm curious because you co-authored with the Dalai Lama. You're probably one of maybe 10 people in the world who's ever written a book with the Dalai Lama. I'm not sure how many books there are out there with him, but I'm curious of the backstory. How did you first meet the Dalai Lama?
Well, I met him when I was living in Western Massachusetts, and Bob Thurman, who's best known as Uma Thurman's dad, but actually is a very serious professor of Buddhist studies, just retiring from Columbia. Bob then was teaching at Amherst College, and he invited the Dalai Lama there. This was the 80s. He wasn't that well known. He wasn't the rock star he's become. And Bob introduced me to the Dalai Lama, and the Dalai Lama said that he was interested in meeting with scientists. And at the time, I was a science journalist with the New York Times. And I said, well, I think I can help you. And I started putting together meetings with the Dalai Lama and scientists with an organization that has become the Mind and Life Institute. They still do that. And from that time on, my wife and I have gotten to know him a little bit better. And then I was approached by someone in his close inner circle as he was approaching 80, who said, we'd like to have a book done that captures his vision for the world, and we'd like you to write it. And of course, I was thrilled. So essentially, he's not a co-author. I wrote the book about him and his vision, but of course I couldn't write it without interviewing him extensively. So that was very delightful just to spend time with him. He's one of the most joyous, nourishing people I've ever met.
Yeah, from everything I've watched or read, and even listening to your book, that really came through in the audiobook version. When working with him to interview him for the book, was there any particularly surprising advice that he gave that you weren't necessarily expecting?
I wouldn't say that he gave a lot of advice. It's not that kind of book. But what was surprising was what I found when I shadowed him for the book, because I felt I should talk about him as a person. And so I would go to meetings. I went to one meeting with a group of CEOs. It was invitation only, private, under the radar. And maybe 15 or 20 CEOs are sitting around a table with the Dalai Lama and asking him questions. And they had hired a photographer to memorialize the day, and he's taking pictures throughout. And at one point, he ends up on the floor with his camera pointed up at the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama stops what he's saying, looks at this guy with amusement, and says, while you're down there, why don't you take a nap? That's the kind of guy he likes to joke around. But what surprised me, and what I found really wonderful, was at the end, the CEOs and the Dalai Lama posed formally for a picture, and the photographer took it. And then as that group was breaking up, the Dalai Lama gestured to the photographer, come here, come here. And he hugged him close and had a picture with the photographer. I thought, wow, that was a wow for me, because he treats everyone equally. He doesn't believe in rank, prestige, celebrity. He just sees people as people. And, I thought, well, that really shows it.
I love this section in the book about this idea of humane economics and the idea that business doesn't have to be only about shareholders or being extractive. For folks who haven't read the book, what are some of the basic underlying principles that the Dalai Lama was advocating for in this part of the book?
Sure. Well, the first thing he says is get your inner act together. Mindfulness helps. Therapy might help, whatever it is that helps you stay calm and clear and focused. Because he says, and he's become pretty sophisticated about brain function as a result of his dialogues with scientists over the years. When you are calm and clear, then you can take in information most fully, understand it most deeply, and respond most nimbly. And that makes you most effective. Then he says, add to that the outlook of compassion, that we're all one, that everyone wants to be happy, no one wants to suffer. And with that compassionate attitude, then act in the world. He names 5 or so things you can do. One of which is, for example, help the needy. That's a no-brainer. Be active in the environment. That's a no-brainer. And one of the things that surprised me was he said business is also, or economics is an area where you can be active as a force for good. And what he meant there was 2 things. One, he feels that the very system of capitalism is unfair and that we need to rethink economics from the get-go. That's a big order. But he said, meanwhile, business itself can be a force for good. And, the kind of thing that you're doing with B Corps is a very good example where a business from the get-go in its charter says we're not just about making money, but we have this mission as well, and we should be evaluated in terms of our mission, not just profitability. He loves stories and examples, working examples of people who are using business to make the world a better place. I told them about one of my favorites. It's the Grayston Bakery. I don't know if it's a for-profit or a B Corp or non-profit.
Yeah, it's a B Corp. Yeah.
It's a B Corp, yeah. So the Grayston Bakery has an interesting backstory. It was set up by a fellow who I also happen to know, Bernie Glassman, who's a Zen Roshi, who is very engaged in compassionate action. And at the time, his Zendo was in the Bronx, and it was a very poor neighborhood. He wanted to help people in the neighborhood, many of whom were, ex-cons who couldn't get jobs or homeless moms with kids and so on. And what they figured out was that they could start a bakery and teach people who otherwise didn't have jobs how to work in a bakery. And that was the beginning of Grayston Bakery. If you eat Ben & Jerry's chocolate fudge brownie ice cream, you're eating brownies from Grayston Bakery. That's one of their biggest contracts. Every day they send a couple truckloads full of brownies up to Vermont, where they're mixed into ice cream. But Grayston Bakery has become very, very profitable. And their motto is, we don't hire people to bake brownies. We bake brownies to hire people. I think that's wonderful. The Dalai Lama loved that example. But, there are many, and I know that your listeners and people that you're involved with are all about such businesses. And as far as I'm concerned, the more of that, the better.
You mentioned how economics needs to be rethought. I'm curious if in your interviews with Dalai Lama, if you had any specific for example, getting rid of debt-bearing interest or more worker ownership, or were there particular themes or ideas?
Well, our discussion wasn't as fine-grained as that. What he said was this, that the growing gap between rich and poor is a moral crime. That's what he said. He didn't say how to fix it. He isn't that prescriptive, actually. He doesn't give advice. He doesn't say, you do this, they do that. He says, here's the goal. The goal is that we have economic injustice, and we want to correct that. How you get there depends on what you have at your disposal, what you can do. Can you start a business that will be more fair in how it operates? Can you work at the policy level? Can you get rid of, interest-bearing debt, whatever it may be? That depends on the person. But what's interesting is we found that the best leaders do the same thing. They say, here's the goal. Here's what your objective is. It's up to you as to how you get there. And I think that makes all of us players in the same game.
Yeah, I remember several years ago, I watched a video of him speaking, I think at a Commonwealth Club or something, but someone was like, how does the U.S. deal with China? And be very specific. And he picked up the gavel on the lectern and he's like, use this. I think he doesn't really... He doesn't really like to get too specific. I think I agree with you. He likes the principles behind it.
Exactly. And one of the interesting things he says, by the way, is that education is the key to all of this. He's very, very actively encouraging people to rethink our educational system. And one of the ways that I've gotten involved in that is, for years, since I wrote Emotional Intelligence, there's been a movement called social emotional learning. The book Emotional Intelligence was actually an argument for bringing this aspect of human development into the classroom so that kids hit the right emotional and social markers in those developmental lines. But now I've added to that, what about mindfulness, helping kids focus with, now that attention is under siege, particularly you see 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds with a toy that's a video monitor and they're glued. And I feel that there's going to be a problem because of that. The other thing I've been advocating is compassion and empathy as part of the ordinary education. But there's a third thing, and that's systems thinking. By the way, I have another book called The Triple Focus in Education, which I wrote with Peter Senge, which goes into more detail about this. That's also, like most of my things, available for More Than Sound. But what we're saying is that kids will be better for the future if kids grew up with systems thinking as just natural for them, that they thought about the complexities. Because when you say, for example, we're going to change the economy, you're talking about a very complex set of arrangements and laws and dynamics. And if you're going to interfere in one part of a system, it will ramify in another part. And you need to understand all of that. But it's not just enough to understand systems. You need to bring compassion to that. And I'm happy to say there's a very prestigious high school program. It's called the International Baccalaureate Schools. They're all over the world. They are now developing a program in compassionate systems to bring into K through 12 education. I think it's this kind of thing that will bring into how the leaders of the future are thinking about things, And that's going to help us turn this ship around, which is, I see it, the biggest goal.
If we were to follow the news only, you might think on a global level, things are going downhill, especially with the election of Trump. Do you actually feel like things are overall getting better or getting worse?
I'll tell you what the Dalai Lama says about that, because that's a question I asked him. And he answered it in two ways. One was pretty amusing. He met Queen Elizabeth's mother while she was alive, just as she turned 100. And he said to her, well, you've been around 100 years. Do you think it's getting better or getting worse? And right away, she says, oh, it's getting better. And she starts ticking off all the things, women's rights. When she was born, England had all of these colonies, and now they're free countries. I thought it was ironic that she named that, on and on. If you take the long view, as the Dalai Lama does, it's getting better. And if you look at the news, you get a very distorted picture. And as a former reform newsman, I used to be at the New York Times, I know that the front page stories are heavily weighted toward things that are upsetting somewhere in the world. And that's because the one role of the media is as the central nervous system of society, and you need to know what the threats are so you can prepare. So the news does skew our view of what's going on. Actually, and this is something that I heard from Jerome Kagan when he was presenting at a conference with the Dalai Lama. He was telling the Dalai Lama this. He said, think about it. If you had a scale of justice, different weights on different sides, two little dishes, and you put on one side all the bad things, the evil things, the horrible things that happen in the world on that one day, and on the other side, all the acts of kindness, consideration, goodness, moms packing lunches for their kids, whatever it may be, the good far outweighs the bad on any given day. It just doesn't make the news. So from that point of view, it's not as bad as we think. Actually, the social fabric is very strong and in a very good way. And the news we do hear is a small, small slice of the reality in any given day.
I recently interviewed Tom Steyer, the billionaire Democratic donor. He's also president of Next Gen Climate, which is a political action committee to basically reduce carbon emissions. And I asked him an interesting question. Well, at least what I thought was an interesting question. I asked him, I see this two things being true, what you're doing or what in the political space, what's happening is one, I believe that your advocacy for reducing climate change and stopping President Trump's agenda is needed because I'm not sure that anyone else would be doing it. So I was saying that I think that's needed. And I'm not sure that just traditional partisan jockeying, like anytime someone says the Republicans, I know it's immediately not using nonviolent communication. And so I'm curious about your thoughts of this. How do we both progress in a positive, change-oriented way, but also be mindful of sort of the no? How do you balance progress with saying, no, this is not right?
Well, let me zoom out because I think there's a bigger perspective here. Let's take climate or the environment as a case in point. It's a very complex system, and we're focused on carbon. Carbon, of course, is a crisis for the world. But actually, there are 8 global systems that support life on the planet, carbon being one, potable water, drinkable water being another. And in fact, we're going to hit a wall with water before we hit a wall with climate, although water doesn't get talked about very much. I'm in favor of looking at all those systems and then looking at our world and how we do things, because my theory is that whenever those systems are being degraded, someone's making money somehow. And this is, again, back to the role of business. There are a couple of things that would change that. One is if we were to assess business practices, and I mean industrial processes, transportation, energy, and so on, using a methodology that's now been around for a couple of decades, life cycle assessment, where, for example, you take a glass and you break it down into the almost 2,000 separate steps along its way from gathering sand to when it's thrown away and decomposes very slowly, it gets ground up. Along the way, you took a bunch of chemicals and sand and you mixed them together and you heated them for a long time at a very high temperature, which of course is very bad for the carbon situation. But you've also had a range of negative impacts at every step of the way for all those global systems, emissions into air, water, and soil, or toxins emitted, workers exposed to dangerous substances, on and on and on. And we now have a math for that. So if that became more widespread and the findings were transparent, I love that one of your points is transparency. And if the cost of getting that information were zero, what I mean by that is it's attainable now, but it's very hard to get. A model for zero cognitive effort is what happened in Maine with the Hannaford supermarket chain. They asked nutritionists to rate every product on their shelves on a 3, 2, 1, or no star system. And everything canned and processed got zero because they had too much salt or a lot of problems, chemicals. But the fresh foods and so on got a 1 or 2 or 3. Market share shifted over the course of a year toward the more stars. And the reason was they put that rating right next to the price. So that means there was no effort needed to get that information, but you gave consumers a decision point. And I think to the extent we could do that, we would be shifting things without having to say yes or no to policy. This is actually an end run around government and policy making. I've read an interesting op-ed that said, well, even if Trump says no to Paris or whatever the agreement is, so much is going on in lowering carbon emissions that we may make our goal anyway. And my own feeling is that the government and government policy is too susceptible to the vagaries of politics. Who knew that the Republicans would take over and say no to all of Obama's climate measures? On the other hand, business itself is an enormously powerful force and one that leaps boundaries, it leaps national boundaries. A market force can change things in a way that the government simply can't. So it's another way in which business can be a force for good, even when government is not so good.
I love that example of the stars next to the price. I think what the Certified B Corporation is trying to do is to be that logo that consumers can trust. So we'll see how much it takes off.
Well, exactly. And I think the B Corp and having a logo, if people recognize it and value it, is one of those many steps that we can take in the better direction of business as a force for good.
One of the questions that we've seen in our consulting practice, and this is slightly around the idea of business, but what the individual should bring into business and what is the business's responsibility. So it's around this distinction between how much of someone's personal background or personal even trauma that they should bring into a company environment to sort of be whole. And then to what extent is it the individual's responsibility or the organization's responsibility to help them be more whole at work?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I don't think about it in terms of trauma or wholeness, which has to do with the kind of psychological, the inner psychology of people, but rather with the values. And it may be that traumas lead to certain values, or healing a trauma does. But I think that businesses more and more are going to have to align with the values of the people who come there to work. Particularly, for example, in a way that businesses really pay attention to is, well, what attracts and retains talent? We need talented people in our business. And, all of a sudden, it turns out that what your position is and what you're doing to the environment matters to people. All of a sudden, businesses are sobering up. And I'm not talking about B Corps. I'm talking about major corporations that are seeing that their own policies in areas like that matter to their employees. And to the extent that business starts to take this into account and to change operations, to change the way it proceeds in a way that aligns with the better values of younger employees who will be there for a long time, or at least they hope, or attracting people going in the future, business is going to have to get better in the values dimension. And I'm not sure, Ryan, I answered your question. I welcome you to ask it in a different way.
No, I think that's getting to the core of it. I think the question itself is probably a little muddy. It was just around this increasing movement to bring who you are and not have a mask at work into the workplace. Should there be any mask? And what's the boundaries of that mask? Is it like traumas? Should they come up or not?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. Well, there's another thing that speaks to that, and that is the fact that the best leaders are people that you love working for. And one of the things that makes a leader like that has been articulated really well by a friend of mine, George Kohlreiser, who does a lot of leadership training, and he calls it secure-based leadership. The model is a good parent, or a good enough parent, it's called. Someone, a mom or a dad who tunes into a kid, who lets that child know you're cared about, you're understood, you're empathized with, you're nurtured, you're protected. What's said about that kind of parenting, which the psychiatrist who articulated it was named John Bowlby, he said, we need that all through life. And George Kohlreiser makes the point that the best bosses, the ones people want to work for, not dread working for, have those qualities and make you feel protected, cared about, nurtured. Not that they won't give you good performance feedback as needed. Clarity is part of that, but that's also like boundary setting with the parent and a kid. And that the more a leader is someone who can empathize and care about the people that they're working with, the better the performance they'll get, the more loyalty, the more people want to give whatever they have brought to work. And in that kind of environment, safety and trust is intrinsic. So you can be yourself. You don't have to hold back. You don't have to hide. So speaking to your point, I think that kind of a working environment lets people let down and bring their whole self to work.
On a more broad level, what are you most excited about right now?
Well, I just wrote a book which will come out in September. It's called Altered Traits, How Meditation Transforms the Mind, the Body, and the Brain. And we're trying to clear the air because there's a lot of hype around mindfulness in business and a lot of claims made on the basis of studies that don't really hold up. So we kind of separate the wheat from the chaff here. When you take the 1% of studies, there's 6,000 now articles, academic articles on meditation. You take the 60 or so that are really good. The evidence is quite compelling that it does work. It doesn't necessarily do everything that people are claiming, particularly people bringing mindfulness into the business world, might I say. But there's no question that mindfulness is a good thing. You've been a meditator for a long time, I gather, Ryan, as have I. The more you do, the larger the effects become. And at the highest level, some of the things found in Tibetan yogis, for example, by Richard Davidson, are pretty spectacular. And what that's done is to give me a different sense of priorities, and that even though I'm quite active and involved in different endeavors, writing books and business and speaking and so on, actually what I'd like to do is step back and go on retreat more. So that's what's exciting me, not getting excited.
Yeah, you have some beautiful, well, I guess you're in New York now, but especially Western Mass, I know some amazing retreat centers.
Yeah, that was one of the things that drew us there. Goenka has a center 2 towns up from us, and Insight Meditation Society is like 45 minutes away. For some reason, that became a magnet. But, that was true some decades ago. Now, meditation has spread, mindfulness has spread so much that I think you can find good teachers everywhere.
What do people never ask you that you wish they did?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure I have an answer because I can't think what that question would be. Well, I go around and have for decades talking about how important emotional intelligence is and why it makes someone an outstanding leader or team member or, spouse, parent. People don't ask me about regular intelligence and why is that important, or is it? And I actually think it is. But I never get asked that question.
So how important is regular intelligence, Dan?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. I think it's 100% necessary that we need to be competent cognitively, no matter what it is we're doing. In and of itself, and this is the point I'm always making, it's not enough. I knew people, from school who were brilliant as test scores certified, who never did much with their career or their lives because of some failing in emotional intelligence. And, they weren't motivated, or they were awkward with people. They didn't empathize, whatever it may be. They were held back. So I see them both as essential skill sets.
And besides anything that you've written, what is the book you most often give as a gift?
It's a book called Zen Flesh Zen Bones.
Tell us more about that.
It's by a poet named Paul Reps. I don't think he's alive anymore, but it was one of the first translations into English from the Zen literature, particularly short accounts of someone becoming enlightened. And I got it when I was a young teenager, and it kind of opened my mind to the fact that there might be other dimensions that weren't talked about at school or in our psychology that were extremely exciting and important. And I think that's what led me essentially to go to India years later.
Speaking in particular about meditation in the West, all the folks that you mentioned early on in the podcast, I'm incredibly grateful for, just because now we don't have to go to India anymore necessarily.
That's right. Yeah, luckily, because it's more polluted than China now.
Right.
I don't think I could go back. I haven't gone back in several years. But, there are excellent teachers now in the West in meditation. But, meditation is helpful in very profound ways. I don't think it's enough to be that force for good. I think it helps us along that path. But as the Dalai Lama says, it's very important for each of us to act now, no matter what that may mean for our particular affordances, our ability to do this or that. But that we don't just wait, but make whatever it is that we can do real now. And meditation is good as preparation for that. But if you only meditate and don't act, I think that's not enough.
Right. It's the balance of being the Zen master on the mountaintop versus actually working in the towns and helping.
Well, it's actually an ideal that many of the Asian traditions have, which is, you go off, you get whatever attainment or progress you can, then you come back and you share it. That's compassion. That's putting it into action. And I think that a B Corp or an enterprise like Greystone is compassion in action. And by the way, I'm not totally dismissive of multinationals or companies that have shareholders and are beholden to them. Let me tell you a story about one, Unilever, which is a major multinational. I happen to have met the grandniece of the man who formed Unilever. He was a Belgian who had a patent on margarine around the turn of the 19th to 20th century. And he was a son of a bitch. He put other companies, and there are many margarine companies, it had just been invented decades before. He would sue other companies and tell them either you sell to me or I'll put you out of business. And he ended up with a local area monopoly within Europe on margarine. And one of the main components of margarine is palm oil. This is a guy, by the way, who was notorious for being a guy you did not like. He realized that another industry used a lot of palm oil. It was the soap business. So he formed a company with the Lever Soap Company. He was Uni and they were Lever. That was Unilever. And they had great economies because they could buy palm oil, in big amounts at lower prices. So fast forward, a friend of mine is coaching the co-CEOs of Unilever back 10 years or so ago when they bought Ben & Jerry's ice cream. Now, did you know that Unilever even owned Ben & Jerry's? No, you didn't. Probably. I didn't.
Well, the only reason I did know it is because Ben & Jerry's is a B Corp. That's the only way I knew it.
There you go. Yes, exactly. So this guy said to my friend, we are hoping to inject the values DNA of Ben & Jerry's into Unilever. Well, that's interesting. Basically, what he's saying is that we want to bring that orientation into the whole business. And now the present CEO of Unilever a couple of years ago announced these amazing goals, which include not only lowering carbon emissions much more than most other companies are trying for, but also he said we're going to start sourcing raw material in 500,000 small farms in the third world. And to do that, we have to teach these farmers how to use better methods so we can depend on them and so on. So what he's getting is not just a more dependable supply chain. He's doing what the World Bank says matters most for rural development in impoverished areas. He's bringing a steady income, which increases education, increases health, increases the well-being of the whole community. And this is, big business doing this. So I think the more that can happen, the better. So it's not just startups, B Corps that are involved in the game. I think everybody should be.
I love that example because I think publicly traded companies get a lot of heat. So I love the example of Unilever. Last few questions here before we wrap up. Who else should we talk to? Who inspires you? Clearly, the Dalai Lama. You mentioned some other folks in the meditation, mindfulness space. Who do you look to for inspiration around this force for good idea?
Well, I just got a new book from someone that would be wonderful for you to interview. Maybe you have. He's a businessman, but an environmentalist, Paul Hawken. Have you seen his new book, Drawdown?
It's funny. One of my business partners is he's a senior financial analyst on the Drawdown team. So yes.
Oh, good. Yes, you know about it. Just for your listeners, Drawdown, which is just coming out, talks about the 100 most impactful things that we could do to lower our carbon emissions. And they're very surprising, some of them. The number one turns out to be those little portable air conditioning units that are everywhere now have as a coolant chlorofluorocarbons, which we thought was an improvement over the other chemical, I can't remember the name, that was depleting the ozone layer. But it turns out that they're 1,000 times worse as greenhouse gases than carbon itself. And the important thing is that when those air conditioners reach the end of their life, that the CFCs be withdrawn from them in a way that destroys them rather than releasing them. Well, gee, who thought of that? But actually, the book is full of 100 examples of concrete steps that we need to take. Paul Hawken, as you know, is a businessman himself. So I think he'd be perfect, Ryan.
I will definitely reach out. I appreciate that. Last two things here. What do you need right now? You mentioned the emotional intelligence primers on More Than Sound. How can listeners support your work?
Well, I'd like them also to know about another website, which is the Force for Good. The website is actually one word. Join a Force for, letter for, not word. Join a Force for Good, which is the Dalai Lama's mission. And we're encouraging people to join us, and no matter what it is that you're doing that's good. Let us know about it and be part of an aggregate, an invisible cohort of like-minded people who are a force for good.
I love that idea. So join a force for good. What about other websites? Where can folks learn more about your work?
There's a Daniel Goleman, one word, danielgoleman.info. And I do most of my publishing these days with morethansound.net.
Okay, Dan, I really appreciate your time, and thanks so much for joining.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. To listen to all of our episodes, go to lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also sign up for our monthly newsletter at lifteconomy.com/newsletter. Please also rate and review our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.